This statement of hers was so cryptic, so rife with hidden meaning, that it immediately struck him as something he should probably worry about. As with most of her statements, it was also extremely ominous, and that, plus the crypticness, seemed like the perfect set of precedents for putting him on his guard. He supposed he really should be, shouldn't he? It seemed like it would be the sensible thing to do. He should be interrogating her, demanding her explain herself until it was clear exactly what her plan was. But the problem was worry and wariness both required energy to deal with, and right now he felt far too tired for either of those things. So, in the end, he simply chose to ignore it, and just pulled her a little closer instead so he could sling his arm around her waist and then run his fingers up and down the notches of her spine. He was really drowsy by now, exhausted even. Yet at the same time, he didn't want to sleep because he was not quite ready to leave her. He didn't want to go somewhere she couldn't follow. The awareness of this was intense, and he wasn't even sure of the right words to describe it. Something which in itself was fairly unusual, because where she was concerned, he almost never ran out of words. He really didn't. It was like he stored them all up to scatter them in her direction, and no one else ever got as many as she did. The closest thing he could get to capturing the sensation was that it was more than needing her or missing her, at which point it was hard not to imagine her rolling her eyes, because of course she probably never thought such things about him whilst he was sleeping. But he wasn't her, which was why he was lying there, reluctant to close his eyes, knowing he had something so profound and personal that he wanted to tell her, yet not really understanding how. The confusion reminded him a little of that famous poem, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." He couldn't remember how the rest of it went. He supposed it was the sort of thing that people didn't remember anymore. But there were so many ways he did love her, and they were all so incredibly hard to comprehend or express. Like the way he loved her for wanting the person he was, not the person he had spent his whole life pretending to be, or the way he loved her not only for who she was, but for who he felt he could be when he was with her. Maybe it was not really his fault after all, because why would he want to miss any of that? Why would he want to go somewhere so lonely and silent for minutes, let alone hours, without taking her with him? Florence, with all her elegant Machiavellianism and dark imperatives, with her angular face and gorgeous eyes. He eventually fell asleep still trying to work it all out, only to wake up the next morning with a jolt of surprise when he realized that it had gone 11 in the morning. This was late for them, even more so for him, so it was hardly unexpected to see that she was also still laying next to him, with her hand carding through his hair. For a few moments he just stared at her, blinking and squinting rather sleepily before hearing himself announce from totally out of nowhere,
"I really love you."
This felt like such a random brain ejaculation that as soon as he had said it, he could feel himself feeling embarrassed, quickly followed by a rush of empathy for how disorientated she was when she had just woken up. She didn't show any signs of mockery, though, instead just smiling at him very fondly before running her finger down the side of his jaw.
"We love you too. To the extent that it seems that I can't think of a single thing better to do than to sit here and watch over you whilst you sleep."
He started smiling too, and then lazily fumbled upwards to take hold of her hand.
"I'm going to remind you about that. When you are old and gray, and you try to pretend that you have never been all that soppy with me, I'm going to remind you about the time you spent an entire morning watching me drool over a hotel pillow."
"Thank you in advance. I'm sure I shall be very much obliged."
He smiled again and spent a few moments heroically trying, and completely failing, to summon the necessary levels of energy to check his phone. Oh, fuck. Why can't he seem to manage it? It was right there next to him.
"I'm so tired."
Who knows why he felt the need to inform her of this? It was not as if it wasn't obvious.
"I feel like I've been in a coma."
Her features promptly rearranged themselves into the type of giga-smug expression that implied that she intended to take full credit for his current state of mental and physical collapse. He couldn't help smirking back at her, aware of how his fingers had started straying towards the friction marks that her collar had made without fully meaning to. He immediately tightened his grip on her hand. The touch was possessive, yet somehow rather tender at the same time, a sort of wordless reminder of how happy and appreciative he was that she was so willing to do that for him.
I suppose I should get up.
This was meant as a form of self-instruction, although there was clearly a part of him who thought he should just fuck off, seeing how all he ended up doing was continuing to lay there like a proverbial old beached whale. He saw a photo of one once from Massachusetts, all sad and pale and bloated, yet still marginally more dignified than he was right now. That photo was him. He was the whale. There should probably be some Greenpeace activists camped out around the bed, pouring water over him and trying to irrigate his blowhole.
I think I'm becoming senile. Tell me to get up.
I shall tell you no such thing.
By now, her smug levels were borderline nuclear. It was obvious how much she loved the idea of being the one responsible for putting him in this type of post-orgasmic tiredness.
There is absolutely no requirement for you to get up until you wish to do so.
But I do wish to do so.
Then I'm sure you will manage it without me. Besides, you never do what I tell you.
He huffed out a laugh and then lumbered arduously onto his side so he could hunch himself against her. She was so warm. It was like he could feel her body heat shimmering through the thin fabric of her top, essential and elemental, pulsing out from the very heart of her.
I'm just exhausted.
He didn't even need to see her face to know that the smug expression would have now gone thermonuclear again.
I'm not surprised. You have been exerting yourself?
I have been thoroughly exerting myself.
He had done, though, exerting her into the mattress and within an inch of her life. Exerted so hard he was surprised she would be able to even walk straight today.
I've never heard it called that before. It's quite sophisticated for your standards.
I suppose it is. By the way, you didn't sleep well either. You were very restless during the night. If that helps solve the mystery.
Oh, was I?
You were. It was as if you were having bad dreams.
Oh, I didn't realize.
If he sounded surprised, it was because he was, and he didn't. He never had bad dreams, unlike her. But even if she did, it hardly mattered because he had managed to develop an entire system for dealing with them. He was normally a light sleeper, so at the first sign of her starting one, he would always do something to stop it. Stroking her hair, murmuring something soothing in Latin, and then, if that didn't work, just waking her up entirely before they could take a firm grip.
I imagine this relates to our previous discussion. That general sense of unease you feel. Even in sleep, it pursues you.
I guess. I mean, yeah, I'm not happy with the situation as a whole, and less so now I have Minnie you on board. You know that.
I do know, and I dislike seeing you in such suspense about things.
It makes me feel that this whole situation needs to be resolved sooner rather than later.
Which means what exactly? Just cut the ambiguity for once, Florence. If you have got something planned, then I want you to tell me.
He sounded very firm, although even as he was asking this, he knew that she wouldn't. After all, she hadn't informed him in advance of a single thing she had done so far, and there was no reason to think she was going to change that pattern now. The problem was that as far as she was concerned, this was her version of teamwork. Her job was to toss the hand grenade, whereas his was to benefit from the chaos and then catch his breath and try and process what on earth just happened, while she just sat there and congratulated herself for collaborating so seamlessly. After a few more years together, she might agree to tone it down. To be fair, parenthood would do that. But it was still too early in the day to change her basic template. But then it was also too early to fully change him. And in this respect was yet another reminder of the ongoing challenge he had of learning to embrace her extreme edges exactly as they were. Briefly, he now looked towards her. He didn't have to be happy about it, but he still had enough self-awareness to recognize the mutual irony of the situation, Namely, that it was a struggle she was having to engage with too. She wanted him to be as gleefully rebellious as she was, and still couldn't fully hide the disappointment she felt every time that he wouldn't. He supposed it was a trade-off they had both had to settle for in their own different ways. He wanted her to be more sophisticated and serious, while she wanted him to be less sophisticated and less serious about things, yet regardless of how frustrating it got, they would both still agree to it anyway. They would forgive these parts of each other, their mutually intolerable morals and immorality, because it was a compromise that they felt they had no choice but to make. He guessed that was what love was, wasn't it? To extend a single viewpoint into one that encompassed and made room for a second. It took patience, courage, and generosity, and sometimes he thought it was the hardest thing he had ever had to do in his life. His first marriage had its own problems, yes, but different to these particular ones. Heather was like him. She saw the world in the same way he did, but with Florence, he had to try and see it through her eyes and appreciate her point of view, to understand her, to forgo his perspective, to love and sacrifice for her. In the past, he knew this was something they would have started arguing about, but now he simply sighed in resignation and then ran his hand across her back.
You are a menace.
But that implies I am a threat. I am the opposite, at least where you are concerned.
This, of course, did nothing except reaffirm his long-standing conviction that every shitty thing she did was for his own good. It was incredibly tempting to call her out on it, but he knew it would end up spiraling into the same destructive dynamic they had before. And even then, it was not like it would change anything. He could be genuinely distressed, and she still wouldn't tell him. And she would do it without a single shred of remorse, simply because she would consider her silence to be the most elegant, efficient course of action. Honestly, she could be such a massive pain in the ass when she wanted to be. Goodness knows how she managed to survive in his house for so long. He had been at the point of exterminating her twice.
Fine. You are an annoyance, like the Tasmanian devil or roadrunner. You are a nuisance, a bother, a pest. You know when they describe dogs running loose in parks as a public menace?
I do.
Well, those dogs are you.
Is that supposed to be an insult? You know how much I love dogs. They are simply misunderstood.
Yes, it is supposed to be an insult. They are very rude and inconsiderate.
I don't know about that.
Oh, wow. Are you just going to take that?
It would appear that I am.
Oh dear, Florence Loper. You're turning into a little bit of a pushover, aren't you?
Ha.
She gave an exaggerated sigh and then raised her eyes heavenward like a medieval martyr.
I seem to be suffering from a regrettable lack of willpower.
He couldn't help letting out a snort of laughter, and she swiftly swooped down to rub her forehead against his.
What a handsome smile you have, Angus. I hope our baby has your smile.
He yawned again and then shrugged.
Thanks. Although on reflection, I'd prefer to see it have yours, which aesthetically far surpasses mine.
What about your mouth with my smile? Or vice versa?
No, I don't want it to have my mouth. It would be really unfortunate for the poor thing. I don't know why you like it so much.
That's not up to you to determine, is it? I think it makes you look masculine and dashing. What? Stop looking at me like that. I think you are attractive, obviously. What was it that eccentric veterinarian said to you? You are attractive in your own unique way. Anyway, you should accept the dictum that love is blind.
Maybe in my case, love would be better served through being deaf. That way I could be spared the pain of listening to how sassy you are to me.
Thanks. How tender and kind you are to the woman you love.
Tender and kind is a description far more in Fantasyland than handsome.
As he watched, her eyebrows descended again.
Do you think I have bad taste, Chief Minister?
That's not the point.
It's entirely the point. Which is why, when I say you're handsome, you know that I'm telling you the truth.
This caused him to let out a self-conscious and spectacularly unattractive grunt. Even so, he couldn't deny there was still something exceedingly ego-stroking about lolling around like a beached whale, with his hair even more mad than usual, while someone was insisting earnestly and at length about how incredibly handsome he was. In this respect, it was also reminding him of a time that his first wife, Heather, had called him purposeful as a husband, rather than handsome. Yet she was the archetype religious wife, with all the glamour of a whitewashed wall, because if there were any justice in this world, which was unlikely, then she would be now spinning in her grave so fast it would alter the earth's magnetic field. It was at this point he realized that his senility had raised its ugly head again, which meant the best thing he could probably do would be to have a shower to clear his head before there was a risk of him saying any of this stuff out loud. She insisted on joining him, standing behind him to scrub his back, then taking advantage of how sleepy and slow he was by moving round to the front and tipping him forwards so she could wash his hair for him. Afterward, she followed him into the kitchenette and then leaned against the counter to watch him whilst he stumbled around in an attempt to brew some coffee. She was usually attentive at the best of times, but even by her own standards, this level of scrutiny from her was extreme. And it was only when he noticed her hands drifting around to the pressure marks of the collar, it then dawned on him she was suffering from an excess of the feels after the whole thing with the collar. She wouldn't be so obvious about it normally, but she began to gaze at him harder than before, and it was impossible for him not to feel rather touched by how trusting she had been. He didn't blame her. Last night was very striking. Yet another illustration of how much better he had become at asking permission to clamber over her barriers, and her, not only to let him, but then to bask in the hidden feeling that lay on the other side. Her being far more trusting in relinquishing her control, simply understanding that he would keep it safe for her, and then hand it back whenever it was wanted. It was also true that the sex may have been a more dramatic example of it. Yet it was not like it wasn't happening in other countlessly small ways day to day. As if she was reading his mind, she now appeared silently behind him to wrap her arms around his chest. It was one of her classic ambush moves. No doubt Lorenzo and Luis had experienced a similar one. And he smiled to himself and then gave her an affectionate stroke of her arms and turned around to put his hands on her shoulders.
You were perfect last night.
She awkwardly cleared her throat a few times before realizing what she was doing and made a conscious effort to just stay with the compliment rather than trying to laugh it off.
Well, so were you. It was incredible. It always is with us.
Before she could even finish, he was trailing his finger up and down her throat in the sort of leisurely, sensuous way that was guaranteed to make her shiver.
You are so sensitive. Your body has learned to be so attuned to me now. You can't help yourself now. Can you, Florence? I believe I could make you orgasm without you even wanting to.
She laughed.
Yeah, you definitely could. After all, you did a lot of things to me in the past that I didn't want you to do, and you did them anyway.
This time he sighed, in a way that was positively lavish in how deep and shouldering it was before skimming a hand down her chest to her waist, lingering a few moments before running both his hands round to her bum.
Come back to bed.
She laughed again, and then nudged her head against his shoulder.
No, I don't feel like it.
Please.
No. I still haven't recovered from last night.
He kissed her temple in response.
Why? Did I hurt you?
No, of course not. Not at all. I just mean that I'm a bit achy. And besides, I thought you were tired.
He made a soft humming noise, although whether this was from relief that she wasn't hurt, or the realization that he was indeed a bit tired, it was impossible for her to gauge.
Then come to Cuernavaca with me.
From going back to bed to going to Cuernavaca? That's quite the difference.
I want to take you both shopping.
What? Seriously?
I am entirely serious.
But it's ages away.
It's only an hour.
By car. Which we don't have.
Then I'll hire a cab.
No way. It would be cheaper to rent a car for what they would charge. What about people seeing me? How come you have changed your mind so suddenly?
Her tone of voice must have made it obvious that she was not backing down, because he now gave another extravagant sigh before letting go entirely so he could lean against the counter with his long legs stretched out in front of him. She extended her own leg and then gave his foot a nudge with hers.
I know I've been tedious on the house arrest thing. I know I am always super sensible. But I do think there is weight to your argument about Giovanni withholding your involvement in the case at this stage to take advantage of it. And we do need to think about getting some things for the baby. I know that's a long way off yet,
A very long way off.
but you can't blame me for getting excited about it.
I'm sorry. I do appreciate the offer and your excitement, but it just doesn't seem the right day today. We're both tired.
On the contrary, it is the perfect day. I wish to indulge you and require an opportunity to do so. Who knows where your face will be splashed by next week?
You always indulge me. I don't have to go to Cuernavaca to be indulged. There's also Amazon. We normally get what we need from there, don't we?
I suppose, yet how inspired I am to take you anyway. It's a curious feeling. I want you to be my companion, my equal in all things. Yet at the same time, I want to spoil you and treat you to nice things and show you off, bankrupting myself in the process.
He was being a bit frivolous, but beneath the playful tone, she could tell that this was a rare piece of self-disclosure on his part. The contradiction he was expressing was genuine, because whilst it was true he wanted her to be his equal, his collaborator and confidant, her relative moral impurity was still something that fascinated him, even as he was actively trying to ease her away from it. He alluded to it only a few weeks ago, whilst reminiscing about the way she was when they first met.
You were always so innocent compared to everyone around you, like the Lamb of Revelation, a symbol of tormented justice, whilst I struck down evildoers like you with a godlike vengeance, for just getting in my way.
And so much has changed since those days, yet in many ways the dynamic still stayed the same. He still wanted to be the godlike maniac who destroyed evildoers. But his moral compass had since been skewed, and she still played the innocent among the impure, but deep down, just as impure, if not worse than everyone around her. It was a facade they put on, a costume that was convenient, but no longer was. It was like he wanted her to be both saintly among the pagans, yet simultaneously debased. Both his Madonna and the whore, a proxy for his moral equal, whilst a willing canvas for all his most depraved, destructive, forbidden desires. She supposed he never expected to find someone who could house such contradictions within the same mind and body, so similarly to himself. And she knew it was why he got such a charge of her submitting to him, not because he had forced her into it, like before, but simply because she wanted to. And the sex, once again, might be an especially visceral demonstration of this, yet they both knew the concept was infinitely more complex. After all, he had spent his entire life weighted down by a conventional sense of what's good and what's evil. Loving her was a limitless exercise in having to reconsider it, and never fully knowing which side his particular coin was going to fall was always going to be an endless source of captivation for him. In the end, she just glanced up and then smiled again. It was not as if he needed any of this spelling out. She knew he understood. And besides, it was not like she didn't view him in a similarly contradictory way. She wanted him as a pillar of strength and power, whose reputation for unnecessary, brutal violence that she could exploit to protect her. Yet she also needed him and his deep, cavernous vulnerabilities as a source of comfort and tenderness. She supposed it had always been this way, hadn't it? It was why everything they did was so emotionally charged. He thought she was a dirty, rude, licentious pagan, and she turned out to be virginal and pure. She was a martyr to her people, and she showed no fear of him. She had expected him to be a brutish, depraved, perverted, egotistical man, and even though he hid it well, His humbleness and desperate loneliness were what she in the end discovered.
Well, that's okay. I can be both.
He immediately smiled back at her before uncurling himself away from the counter to move closer. It was like he could only go so long without needing to touch her. She smiled again herself, then hooked both arms around his neck so she could gaze back at him.
It won't take me long to recover.
His phone suddenly alerted he had a message, and he temporarily let go of her whilst fumbling in his pocket for it. He frowned as he read the message.
That's good. We can go back to bed as soon as I get back.
Get back from where?
Last-minute change of plans. I need to go to the church. Giovanni needs me.
This time there was another longer pause. It was obvious to him how pissed off she was, and while it seemed she was going to honor their agreement by not arguing over it, he was still fully aware of how bad he had made himself look. Normally, he only had limited patience for her demands and never focused on anything except her. But this time there felt something particularly clumsy and hurtful about proposing to spend a romantic day together only to run off and spend all afternoon with Giovanni instead.
Look, I'm sorry. If you'd really prefer me to stay, then I will.
But then I would not be holding up my end of the bargain. If you want to, you should go.
But I don't want to. That's half of the problem.
For a few moments he simply gazed at her before her expression began to soften.
I suppose Uncle Giovanni is harassing you again. What seems to be his problem this time?
Nothing specific. I just don't want him checking up on me. He always gets angsty if he hasn't seen me for a few days. He thinks you're going to arrive on your broomstick and murder me.
Typical.
Well, you can't surely blame him. You shouldn't have killed that Mexican minister, should you?
This made her sigh again. For a few moments, she looked like she was struggling not to roll her eyes at him.
I wish it were Giovanni instead.
I thought he was no real threat to you.
Whatever else you are mine. And I'm not prepared to continue sharing you with Giovanni for very long.
It won't be for long.
He deliberately misinterpreted her meaning now, but any discussion about her ultimate plans for Giovanni were bound to spiral into a fight, not least because she still refused to outright discuss them. And the last thing he wanted to do was to destroy the positivity of the last few days with another pointless argument.
I'll be back in time for dinner.
As late as that? That seems rather excessive merely to put Giovanni's mind at rest.
He gave a small sigh of his own and then placed his hand on her arm.
But I'm not going just for Giovanni. I told Carly I'd work through some of her theories with her.
Instinctively, he disliked mentioning Carly, but after last week's conversation, he knew he disliked the idea of lying to her even more. All the same, he still held back from revealing the real reason he wanted to see her, namely to keep a closer eye on how things were progressing on the Lorenzo copycat investigation. This caution felt more reasonable, seeing how it was Florence, but there was no doubt that even a hint of being concerned about it might be disastrous for Carly's safety. If Florence thought she was close to uncovering the truth, then, pregnant or not, Florence wouldn't hesitate to go after her, and all his assurances to the contrary were never going to be enough to stop her. It was her nature. He couldn't change it. All he could do was to avert a situation where she felt like she needed to act. Fortunately, none of this turmoil managed to show itself on his face, because she now started to smile again, pleased at how honest he was being, then pressed a farewell kiss to his forehead in a protective, almost motherly way, before letting go entirely so she could prowl over to the desk to retrieve the tablet, and she settled down on the sofa with it. He felt touched by this image. He thought it was because it managed to illustrate how much more relaxed he was, learning to be with all her questioning. He used to get so frustrated with her in the past, but in the last few months he had begun to see it differently. At worst, something he could tolerate, but at best, something he could enjoy. Because he could. He enjoyed trying to decode her. She was like Churchill's attempts to forecast the actions of Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. But perhaps there was a key. He now threw her a quick glance. How inscrutable she looked as she leaned back against the cushions, relaxed and informal in a way she never used to be when they first met. Did she have a key? Sometimes he thought she did, whereas other times he wasn't so sure, although he knew it was safe to say that she felt the same way about him. She was also searching for his key, and it was the inability to fully solve each other that kept them coming back for more. As if drawn by the force of his stare, she now looked up herself and caught his eye.
I love you.
And I you. I adore you, Angus. You are everything to me.
She sounded deeply sincere, and the force of emotion she was expressing filled him with a sudden, urgent sense of how he didn't want to leave her, not even for the few hours it would take to see Giovanni. It was the same helpless devotion that had overwhelmed him last night, and the intensity was almost enough to scare him, because even now he was still not used to feeling so fiercely dependent on another person as he was on her. They could torment and torture each other as much as they liked, without it being enough for either to walk away, yet now their incentive was a positive one. The power of it left him utterly breathless. By this point, there seemed like a genuine risk he could be standing there all day, and he now gave himself a rough mental shake. He had to leave, he told himself firmly. This was what responsibility was. He had to keep them all safe. With a huge effort, he forced himself to collect his stuff and then finally turned around to mutter with an obvious reluctance,
I had better get going.
As he watched, she glanced up from the tablet and then began to smile at him. The faint shadow falling across her face made her eyes seem as if they were gleaming.
See you very soon.